Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our week of kind of random subjects, which is kind of fun to bring in the people that I've been wanting to bring in and talk about things that haven't fitted neatly into one of my theme weeks. And we are talking about a unit that I received our guest's book a few weeks ago in the post. I've been dipping in and out of it, kind of treating it like a kind of a box of chocolates. SBS Silent Warriors by Saul David, who is a multi-period historian. He's written about numerous eras, mostly kind of British forces, but not exclusively. And we are going to talk about the history of the SBS, one of the units that we know about today. And I was just before I bring him in, I think these days, particularly those British people watching this show, we understand what the SAS do, we understand what the SBS do, the Royal Marines, the Parachute Regiment. They have quite defined roles. Back in the early days of Special Forces, 1940, 1941, those roles weren't so clear. So we're going to have someone going to walk us through exactly how this unit started, what its purposes were, and the huge number of variety of missions they were involved in. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Saul David. So good evening. How are you today?
Very well. Good to see you, Paul.
So I said it there in the introduction. It is a unit that has a clear kind of end point, and we know what the unit does now, but it does start in a very odd way. And I want to kind of ask you, kind of how did it come about? And we're going to talk about Churchill here. And when you were writing the book, how did you kind of decide where the tributaries of the river began? What's the source of the Nile in this sense? Because it's not absolutely clear. Now, we want to make it clear yours is the kind of first official history of the unit, but how difficult was it to navigate it back to the source of the Nile there?
It was tricky. I mean, and the reason it was tricky is because up till now, it was a lot of people disagreed when the SBS in the Second World War actually began. But I simplified matters, Paul, really by using chronology. Really, I mean, which was the first strand that eventually, you get these multiple different strands, which the SBS today acknowledge from different directions. But which was the first of those strands? And the first of those strands, as you've alluded to, came out of the Army Commandos. So we're in the summer of 1940, dark days, things are looking pretty grim. We've been kicked out of France after Dunkirk. We've lost our main ally, France, and we're on our own. So Churchill very sensibly creates this striking force, this sort of hunter-gatherer force that he's going to launch against the coast of Europe for good psychological reasons rather than more than practical reasons, in fact. And a strand of this turned into the SBS, and this is how it happened. The 8th Commando, which was the Guards Commando, interestingly enough, which was recruited, of course, from a lot of the London units, both the Horse Guards and also the Foot Guards. One of their officers was a man called Roger Courtney. Now, Courtney had made his name in the 1930s as a big game hunter and a gold prospector in Africa. I mean, really, he was like a Victorian adventurer, and he'd gone out there at age 19, really, to make his fortune. Now, the relevant bit of the African story is that one part of all the things he was doing out there was he was a keen canoeist, or should I say a folbotist, because in the 1930s, really, the recreational type of canoe you might have used would have been called a folbot. It was a folding boat, German design, and he had bought one from a department store in London, taken it out to Africa and used it incredibly to navigate the White Nile River. 4,000 miles he paddled up the White Nile on his own. Now, the relevance of this story is, of course, it taught him how to use a canoe. He became very proficient in the use of canoe, in particular getting in and out, which is terribly important if you're going to use them in a warlike role. But he also realized the stealth with which you could approach shorelines in a canoe. So while he's in the 8th Commando training up in the Highlands of Scotland in the autumn of 1940, he sets the Navy a challenge, basically. He says, I think we can use these canoes on operations, and I'm going to prove to you that they can be used silently and approach a target by coming up against the Commando ship in Inverary Harbour, which they know he's coming. So they've been forewarned, the sentries are all alert, and yet he still manages to approach at night, chalk crosses on the side of the Commando ship, and then scale the Commando ship itself and steal a gun cover. And this was proof of purpose as far as the Navy were concerned, that actually this could be done. And so it's from this point, this is the key moment, that he is able to get permission to form what is initially known as the Folbot Troop. just 12 men, so it's absolutely tiny when it begins, Paul. And out of the Folbot troop will eventually become the special boats section. But you can see the first strand of the story comes from the Army Commandos. And one quick point to make, if you're going to compare it to other special forces in the Second World War, the SAS, as is well known, were not created until the following year by, interestingly enough, a man called Sterling, who, of course, we all know, David Sterling, who was also a serving member of the 8th Commando. So the great irony is both those units came out of the same commando.
Wow. And this is the next kind of thing I want to talk about, is when we talk about perhaps tank doctrine, aviation doctrine. I had Ben Kite on a few weeks ago talking about how the RAF developed post-Battle of Britain, that kind of thing, is we see in some ways kind of slow development. In terms of what we would now call special forces, it was changing so rapidly. Essentially, the British forces have nothing of that kind of special forces nature in 1939. And then by the end of the war, we've got everything from airborne forces to commandos to the SBS, to all these things. And we're operating in all theaters, where the Chindits have come up. And I kind of liken it almost to those Dragon's Den kind of shows we have today, where if you had an idea, if you were a crackpot and you had an idea to either use canoes or rock climbers or whatever, or jeeps in the desert or vehicles or something, you could kind of go to Churchill almost and say, I've got an idea, I used to live here, I can do this, I can get a force there. And they kind of go, yeah, okay, there you are, there's a budget, we'll give you a unit. It's almost that kind of that way in 1940, isn't it?
It is. What you effectively have are a bunch of private armies. They begin as very small private armies who are given life by necessity, so by the circumstances with which we're fighting the war, which is we're losing it on the one hand. And secondly, the identity of the Prime Minister is crucial, because he was a man who, from his young days in the military, he fought, of course, himself. He charged at Omdurman in the last great cavalry charge of the Victorian Wars. And this was a man who believed in irregular forces. He thought they really could make a difference. And I think, as I hinted at in one of my previous answers, I think the effect in his mind was as much psychological as anything else. But it was Churchill who gave the commandos the go-ahead. Out of them came both the SAS and the SBS. And of course, it was also Churchill, around about the time of the creation of the commandos, who also said, let's create a force of 5,000 paratroopers. I mean, it was a bit optimistic, frankly, in 1940, and it took a while to get the paras off the ground. But they also came out of the commandos. The number 2 commando was converted to the parachute, what became the parachute regiment. So it was absolutely vital that Churchill was in that role, and he was prepared to go over the heads of his, let's face it, quite traditional thinking military chiefs, and insist that these special operations units were created. But of course, it was needs must. They didn't have the correct kit. They were trying things out, really. I mean, people were dying in the early parachute attempts. I mean, it was really, just make and mend and get along as best you can. But slowly but surely, and in particular in the case of the SBS, they began to work out methods of carrying out their operations that became increasingly skilled with better kit as the war went on.
And we can talk about that now, if you like, because that's the other thing about relatively small special units, is that they can perhaps prove their worth quite quickly, whereas someone perhaps trying to come up with an entirely new way of using armored vehicles that would involve developing new armored vehicles, producing new armored, and training up people to use that could take a long time to phase in. But if you can say to someone, look, I've got these boats, I can show you how I can do this, I can go and do this, and you can come back and you can demonstrate to these observers that it works, you can get an idea from someone's head, essentially, to a unit being out in the field doing it within a matter of weeks. And so, it is, as we find out in the book, very, very swift process of having this idea to actually being able to go out there and do stuff. And so let's talk about that. But also, I want to touch, before we do that, on the psychological aspect, because I think Churchill's trying to win 2 battles with this idea of these irregular forces. One, it's actually taking the war to the continent and striking back, but also it's giving the people of Britain after Dunkirk and after that an idea, and the world, that we're not done yet. Where no matter where you are, you beastly Germans, we can get you in your harbors, we can get you in your castles, your headquarters. No matter where you are, we have a force that can get you. So that balance between the propaganda aspect and the results aspect is very interesting. All the operations you talk about, there's that. Well, balance is the right word. We get to Operation Frankton perhaps later on. That there and some of the things like the San Jose, which of course is not SBS. There's that. What did it actually achieve? but what does it do for the British public? What does it do to tell people that we can get you? So how important was that at the beginning of the SBS, this idea of just bolstering public opinion and morale?
I mean, the operators themselves, Courtney and his merry band, very small band, in their minds, they wanted to make a real difference. They wanted to have a practical effect. But there's no doubt that Churchill and his and some of the senior military people realized the importance on morale at home, and also psychologically the effect on the enemy. The Italians, of course, in the Mediterranean, and the Germans on the Atlantic Wall, as it became the idea that you could strike at targets at any moment, as you pointed out, Paul. I mean, this was going to have not only a psychological effect on the Germans and their relationship with the French, of course, but also it was going to make them move around troops. It was going to make them fortify the coast and devote resources to defending the coast that actually did make a bit of a difference. So, there were multiple facets in which these little units, who didn't cost that much money because they were always quite tiny. I mean, none of the units I'm going to talk about today were bigger than 100 men, for example. I mean, tiny number of people with, as I said, pretty rudimentary kit to begin with. But to answer the second part of your question, the really striking moment, I think, in the story, and it's an event that's really gone under the radar, is this incredible mission that's carried out by Courtney and a man who becomes terribly important to the story in a slightly different way, a man called Nigel Wilmot, who's Royal Navy. So already you've got Army and Navy acting together. Now, these two meet in the Middle East in the spring of 1941. Courtney's taken his Folbot troop out there with the Commandos and is looking for work. And Wilmot, who has experience of the Narvik operation and the sort of chaos of amphibious operations there, realizes that if we're going to go back into Europe at some stage, which we have to win the war, we need beach reconnaissance. So he's already got his head around beach reconnaissance. It's going to be absolutely crucial. But he doesn't know how to insert his men to do the job, the kind of people who are going to gather that absolutely crucial navigational, hydrographical, and also the defenses on the beach type information you're going to need for successful landings. But fortunately, he comes across Courtney, and Courtney's Folbot is his canoeist, and realizes, hold on a second, we can use these canoes to get in close silently, transported by submarines, get the last distance in with the canoes, then you swim the final distance from the canoe, and you gather that information. I mean, I'm making it sound terribly simple because, of course, it's very complicated. It's incredibly dangerous. And the first mission I was referred to is known as the Rhodes Reconnaissance, which took place in March 1941. It was a daredevil, incredibly dangerous operation carried out with really basic kit. No wetsuits, of course, so they just had woolly jumpers and long johns covered in grease to try and keep the cold off. It was the Eastern Mediterranean in the spring of 1941, incredibly cold sea temperatures. Then there's the danger of being bumped by sentries on land, which also almost happens multiple times. And yet they carry out a reconnaissance of the beaches on the tip of Rhodes, the north point of Rhodes, in preparation for an amphibious assault, which never takes place, Paul. But that's not the point. The point is they got there, they got all the information they needed, and they got away. Now, I mean, I like to think this is one of the great hinge moments of the story, because two of the giants of the story, I think there were three key men in the story of the SBS in the Second World War. The two I've just mentioned, Courtney and Wilmot, and Hasler, who we'll come to, Blondie Hasler, of course, of Cockleshell Heroes fame. But two of those guys could have been captured or killed in the very first operation. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation, because they might have decided, actually, do you know what, canoes are just not the way to do it. But fortunately, they got away. Courtney almost drowns during that operation, but they managed to survive. They come back with the most unbelievable cornucopia of information. And this definitely convinces Wilmot, if not the senior military people at this stage of the war, that beach reconnaissance is going to be crucial. And he will go on, as I'm sure we will discuss later on in our chat, to create COP, Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, which really does, I think, of all the units that we're going to mention tonight, probably makes the biggest contribution to Allied success in the Second World War of all the SBS units.
Well, why don't we talk about that right now then? Because we can go back and forth through the war and the timeline. It doesn't matter. It's just a kind of free conversation today. So let's expand on that, because when we're talking about special forces and secret missions, everyone has this idea that if something isn't being blown up at the end of it, it somehow isn't a special mission. But actually, intelligence gathering, reconnaissance is the bedrock of all of our future amphibious operations, whether it's D-Day, whether it's Italy, whether it's the Far East. It's about building up that knowledge there. So let's expand on what you just said there.
And can I just make a quick point with relevance to the Pacific, because as you know, I've written a book about the Battle of Okinawa. We discussed it before, Paul. I've got a forthcoming one coming up about the Marines in the Second World War, a unit of Marines. And what's interesting about all these incredible amphibious operations is that they do not have a comparative unit to the SBS out there. I mean, they should do, but they don't. What they've got are underwater demolition teams who go in before the actual landings and clear away any obstacles, and they're useful and they do bring back a certain amount of information, but they don't have this pure intelligence gathering unit that, as you say, goes in and doesn't make any noise. That's the whole point. You get in and you get out with anyone knowing you're being there. With a bit of luck, you don't have to kill anyone either. It's this sort of bloodless operation which doesn't always attract, the headlines, and certainly doesn't attract the feature films. This is not, there aren't any big explosions like there were at the end of Cockleshell Heroes, the San Nazar raid, which you also mentioned. And yet they really do play a key difference. And the sequence of events is quite interesting, because if you move on from 1941, spring of 1941, you might think, well, why on earth, given that Wilmot and Courtney have proven that beach reconnaissance can work, why have they not created a dedicated unit to do that? Courtney, I think, is feeling, well, his guys can do that as well as a lot of other things. But Courtney's really thinking in terms of the special boat section, also in terms of sabotage, landing secret agents. I mean, he wants the SBS, the special boat section SBS, to be a Swiss Army knife, to do everything. Wilmot was very much, no, we need a specialized unit just to do beach reconnaissance. It needs to be highly trained and it needs the proper kit. But it took him until the end of 1942 to get permission to form this unit. If you go back to the summer of 1942, he's lobbying hard at Eisenhower's headquarters for the creation of the unit, for the very good reason that they're about to launch the first big amphibious operation in the Western Hemisphere, and that of course is Operation Torch in North Africa. But he is not given permission to create the unit that he wants to in time for Torch. They do send in him and a number of SBS naval navigators to get as much information as they can, but they don't have time to train properly. The unit actually goes in under the codename Party Inhuman, which I think is a bit of a schoolboy joke, as I suggest, in which is not unusual, frankly, for these special operations units. But Party Inhuman is really a half-cocked affair, and while it does play a very useful role in piloting in some of the landing craft, it doesn't get important information about the beaches. So if Operation Torch had been up against a proper hostile shore, that is against the Germans or the Italians, it would have been a much bloodier affair, and could have been a total fiasco, actually, because they simply didn't have the right information about the beaches. They were dropped off on the wrong beaches, and if they'd been properly tackled on those beaches, it could have turned nasty. So as a result, partly as a result of Torch, he comes back and is now able to convince, this is what I was able to do, this is what I wasn't able to do. Now will you let me form a unit? Because we're going to need to do a lot more of these amphibious operations. That's the point at which he is given the go-ahead. And this is when combined operations pilotage parties are created. And by the way, there are a lot of acronyms in these SBS units, Paul, in the Second World War, and they can get quite confusing. And generally speaking, these names are created to confuse. They're not supposed to make sense. Combined Operation Pilotage Party, it's sort of, there was a reconnaissance in the name originally. It sort of makes sense, but it's also a bit of a mishmash. But trust me, you've read some of the bits in the book. These guys do extraordinary work for the rest of the war at Sicily, Italy, and of course, most importantly, D-Day. And interestingly, the story doesn't end there, because they then go out to the Far East and do important work there. There aren't so many amphibious landings in the Far East in 1944 and 1945 for the very good reason that the Americans are doing most of the heavy lifting in the Pacific. It's interesting. The only question mark in my mind, which I wasn't able to prove conclusively, is whether they're ever offered to the Americans during that phase of the war. I suspect not, and they may not even have been accepted. And of course, there is a great story, which I'll expand on if you want me to, about D-Day, when the COP, Wilmot's Cop does amazing work, goes in, scouts out Omaha in January 1944, comes back with an unbelievable amount of information about the strength of the defenses even that early on. This is a good 5 months, of course, before D-Day, and offers the Americans the chance to not only use this information, but I think that, frankly, I think what's going on in the minds of Wilmot and his SBS guys at the time, or his COP guys at the time, is let's give the Americans either a chance to switch beaches. Well, that wasn't going to happen. They were too far deep into the planning process. But okay, maybe we need to guide you in there. Maybe you do need us to show you the right way to that beach so you can get to the right place in that beach and somehow mitigate the very effective defensive positions, which were not right across the beach, but concentrated mainly on those villages. That doesn't happen because the Americans turned down that offer. They do accept pilotage, but they don't accept marking. And I can go into the detail of that if you want to, Paul. But in a nutshell, marking is sending people in advance, popping up on the morning of D-Day and guiding the landing craft in. Pilotage is when you go alongside the landing craft, and of course that's much less accurate. If you've actually got people on the beach, particularly both ends of the beach, you've got a pretty surefire way of getting to the right place.
Well, let's expand on that because, I'm a Normandy guy. I live 15 minutes drive from Omaha Beach. And when I received your book in the post and, and I knew I knew some of the things that were going to be appearing in the book because I knew a little bit about the SBS history. But I think literally the first page it fell open on was the map of Omaha Beach. I was like, oh, hang on. I didn't know. And I'm a self-confessed Normandy nut. I didn't really know this. And partly that's because of the nationalistic way we always look at, like, Omaha is American, Sword is British, and so we kind of think about the units that each country put towards its beaches there. But let's expand on this idea about the January missions and what they identified and what solutions they suggested.
Yeah, well, I mean, I should quickly mention that there were two missions. The first two missions around that time of the year, and the first mission was actually to go to Gold Beach, or at least the join between Gold and Juneau. I mean, originally, as you well know, Paul, there were just 3 beaches. So their job is to look at those 3 beaches, and they originally go into Gold and Juneau to confirm that the sand is firm enough. And I think this is a reasonably well-known story, although it's slightly slipped under the radar. But anyway, they, amazing stuff. They're dropped off by motorcraft. Interestingly, because a lot of the missions that take place in the Mediterranean are done with submarines for obvious reasons. You can get in, reasonably close silently and then use canoes. Well, the sea conditions in the Mediterranean and the depths do not suit submarines and canoes. So generally speaking, it was a swimming job, but you've got to get quite close in. So how do you do that without, being known? And it's very tricky to do that, on a craft that makes a noise. So they took that chance on New Year's Eve, 1943, because they had to confirm that the sand at Juneau and Gold was firm enough to take wheel traffic. Okay, this is really the key thing. Obviously, a soldier can struggle along a beach, but as soon as you've got a heavy vehicle, if it gets bogged down, the landings are going to be a disaster. So they carry out that mission unbelievably successfully. 2 SBS swimmers who are part of a COP team go in there and they carry out that mission. Now, the success of that mission then encourages them to move on to Omaha. Omaha, they know, is a tough nut to crack. They've already, got a bit of a sense from aerial photographs that the defenses are tough, but they don't know quite how tough. So they want a close reconnaissance. And the way they do that, incredibly, is by using midget submarines, the so-called X-craft. Now, the X-craft have been developed. This is a classic example of special operations, making do with kit that actually was developed for another purpose. X-craft were created to sink enemy ships in harbour, and most famously were used to attack Tirpitz up in the Norwegian fjords, very successfully, in fact. And a couple of guys, I think it's at least 2, win VCs, commanders of those X-craft. But they realized X-craft are really quite small, midget subs, only 50 feet long, 39 feet inside, relatively small compared to a full-size submarine. And using these craft, given that the depths are shallow in the channel, you can get quite close in. So they use an X-craft, but it's still going to be an incredibly uncomfortable experience. You've got to lie on the seabed during daytime, and there's always a danger you're going to be spotted. And the other thing, of course, you can do in a midget submarine is you can use its absolutely tiny periscope. It's literally the width of a walking stick to observe the coast, and this becomes absolutely vital for this SBS operation, which takes place in January 1944, just a few months before. Now, when they come back with this information, as I've already alluded to, they brief all the senior commanders who are going to go in for D-Day, and they tell them exactly what they found and the danger of the defences on Omaha. Excuse me. And they suggest the solution is they're going to offer not only marking, that is laying off the beach, but also piloting. Now, the Americans, and basically this is a job they are going to do and do for the British and the Canadians on actual D-Day. Okay, so it's going to happen. The question is, do the Americans want it as well? Yep. Well, incredibly, I think, and really surprisingly, they do not take up that offer. So yes, they are happy to have pilots. Pilots are no problem. They're just going in with a landing craft. They're not going to give the game away, of course, because the game's already been given away. But they don't want to risk sending in these mini subs or any other form of marking. And it, in my view, was a big mistake, because where they are used successfully, which is on the British beaches, you've got, of course, Juno, Gold, and Sword, which is added. And another interesting thing about these SBS operations I should mention, Paul, is I think it's part of the... It's not the only reason, of course, and Montgomery, we know, and Churchill were lobbying for an increased number of beaches. They need to get more soldiers on the ground. That's the thinking. But the information that's brought back by the SBS, particularly the formidable defences at Omaha, I think convinces the Allies, the senior planners, that actually they do need to... This is an extra factor in convincing them that they need to add 2 beaches. So you've now got Utah and Omaha. On neither of those beaches do they use markers. Now, Utah was not as anything like as heavily defended at Omaha, so it wasn't such a problem. But at Omaha, it was a problem. And as is well known already, what happens on D-Day, on the morning of D-Day, as those boats are coming in, is that they get taken by a strong tidal set. Yep. The sea conditions are still bad. D-Day's been delayed 24 hours, as is well known, but the weather's not great on the morning of D-Day. And actually, there's an amazing bit of footage, which I should briefly mention, which is one of the midget submarines coming back to its command ship. Excuse me a sec, Paul.
No worries.
Losing my voice here. There's an amazing bit of footage where you can see the midget submarine coming back to the command ship, and this tiny little thing with 2 guys standing on the deck. And that would have been the view that the landing craft, as they came into the Canadian and British beaches, would have had on D-Day itself. They didn't have them on Omaha, and they didn't have them on Utah. And as I've already explained, it was a problem on Omaha, because people got funneled particularly towards the eastern end of the beach, particularly towards the Colville end of the beach, which was incredibly heavily defended. Partly that, and of course you've got partly the chaos of all these guys mixed up, not knowing where they are, completely chaotic. What you really need with a successful assault landing on a beach is everyone spread out, which was, of course, the plan. What you got is everyone bunched together. So, of course, it wasn't the only reason the casualties were so heavy, but it was definitely a factor, and it could have been mitigated.
And as we know, Omaha is a whole series of little things that had just one of them gone wrong may not have affected it. But when you've got 7, 8, 9, 10 things, however many it is I do on my tours when I go there, it just all compounds on it. But again, as we talked about at the beginning of this, about this idea of special forces, that if you mention SAS to British people, they get a thought in their head. SBS, Rangers, Parachute Forces, Commandos, all these words mean something. We're still talking, even in early 44, the hierarchy of the military planners, the staff officers, they're a little bit older. All of this stuff is newfangled. It's who are these upstarts changing the way we fight wars with their ideas, with their wacky ideas of boats that do this, and their wacky ideas of this. We can, I think, understand why there is a reluctance to kind of believe some of these characters. People, as you're talking about, people like Hassler, they're odd characters. They're not. I mean that in a very complimentary way. I can see why some of these people, Sterling himself in the SAS fame, I can imagine why some people would find these people very, very difficult to kind of invest in until you know that what they're saying can actually reap the rewards that they're promising, because it all sounds too good to be true in some senses, in some cases, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a very good point, actually. I mean, I suppose you turn the argument on its head and say it's amazing that they were used as much as they were, that they were
Yeah.
given the trust that they were given. I mean, in the case of the D-Day operation, of course, those three missions, the two I talked about in December and January 1943, 1944, and then, of course, again on the actual day itself, those submarines, by the way, which mark the beaches or mark either side of Sword and then the other extent of the Canadian and British beaches, those two submarines that carry out that mission have to start their mission on the 2nd of June. It takes them that long to get across the channel and then to lie on the seabed. And of course, then you've got the 24-hour delay. So incredible trust was put in these Mavericks. But as you point out, these guys I've already talked about. Wilmot, not so much, but Courtney was a Maverick. Hasler was a Maverick. Sterling was a Maverick. These are people who are not going to succeed and in some senses do not fare well in peacetime. These are wartime soldiers who come up with brilliant ideas that don't always work, and weren't bound to work either. But they're thinking outside the box. They're trying new things, and they were just the right people at the right time. But I go back to the psychological effect. The psychological effect throughout the Second World War by units like the SBS was immense, in my view. The material effect, or the actual effect on operations of the type that I'm talking about with COP, yes, you can certainly overdo that in the sense that it's arguable that there were so many other factors that play important roles in the success of D-Day and other things. But the psychological effect right the way through the war is not to be underestimated, because there are people, and I'm sure you feel a little bit sympathetic to this argument, Paul, quite rightly, that why should these tiny little groups get all the glory? Yes, they play a role, but let's not exaggerate their role.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you next, really, because our mutual friend James Holland did his recent book, Brothers in Arms, about an armored unit, and you can see that they get to where they're supposed to be. They've made this journey across Europe from where they landed to where the war ended. You see, well, that unit accomplished this. And even your previous book on Okinawa, you can see, okay, they landed there, and then X weeks later, they've now the battle is over. How, as a historian, you've tackled numerous eras and numerous campaigns and wars, how do you measure the success of a unit like the SBS? Because as you say, it's lots of ideas you're balancing. There's the propaganda idea, there's the inventiveness idea, there's things that were implemented but they could have been implemented more. The roads example is something that they got information for something that never happened. How do you therefore measure that success when the net result didn't happen? I mean, I feel a need, I said before we were going live, to mention Operation Mincemeat, because the new version of the film, we've all seen the original Old Man Who Never Was, the 50s one, and the trailer I've seen, the implication is that body off the coast of Spain is an absolute turning point in the war, where had the Germans not picked up those plans, the war would have gone a different way, and we might have lost. That's how they're kind of playing it. That it was, and we all know, anyone who's ever read anything about the operation, that it doesn't have anything like that kind of knife edge moment where the war is being decided by a body. So back to my original question: how do you, when as a historian, measure results when you're talking about a unit as complicated and with a variety of different tasks as the SBS?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that, because as I was finishing off the book and sending the script for the current unit to have a little look at it, in particular the recent CEO, he's no longer there now. That was the first question he asked me, having read through the script, which was, I need a totting up here. I need to get a sense of what they did. I need the tonnage that they sunk and all of that. And that's quite revealing, I think, of his character. Really, he almost wanted a body count, not quite, but you sort of get my point. It's like I need to. The only way I can make sense of their achievements in the Second World War is if I can see materially what they did. But that's my point. It's not just about that, and in any case it's almost impossible and unquantifiable to get that assessment. You can never say it was just them that sunk this as opposed to other factors involved. So the way I like to play it, and the way I do play it in the book, is that you get to the end of the book and you talk about the effect they have in a number of different ways. Yes, they do actually sink a lot of ships. Yes, they do extraordinary beach reconnaissance, which makes a real difference to the planning and success of a number of amphibious operations. Then you get the psychological effect of what's happening at home. Then you get the impact on the enemy and the fact that they're constantly moving around troops. And I don't like to get to a point where I say this is a clear measurement. What I like to convince the reader is actually they were bloody worth creating, because the effects, given the money that was spent on them and then the numbers were involved, I think their impact is out of all proportion to those sorts of metrics. And that's all you really need to know. And the other thing you need to know, Paul, which again we talked about this briefly before we came on air, is that the courage shown by these young men, because they were, generally speaking, I mean, Courtney was an outlier at 38, but pretty much all the rest of them were 30 and under, and most of them in their young 20s. To have the courage, and I know you that's what you're like as a young man. That's why soldiers tend to be 18 to 22, because they don't have they don't have the same kind of sense of fear factor, and generally speaking, they don't always have families. And I get all of that. But even taking all of that into account, to have carried out the missions they did, approaching in a lonely sense, hostile shorelines with just a flimsy canoe around you, always at night, or often in very difficult temperatures that you were unlikely to survive in, going behind enemy lines, particularly after 42, the Commando order, when there was a very good chance if you were captured, you were going to be shot, and many of them were. I mean, the courage that requires to carry out, frankly, an operation which in many cases was complete madness, really. And, you talked about the cockle shell heroes. That was, recently a couple of people were tweeting about that, saying, well, surely it was a suicide operation. In fact, I think it was Al Murray who suggested that, well, yeah, it probably was, actually. And the reason the bit of support for that theory is that when Blondie Hasler, who created the unit that went on the Cockleshell Heroes raid, when he put his plan forward, Mountbatten, his boss, head of combined operations at the time, said, well, you're not going. And he said, well, I've got to go. And he said, no, you're not going, because there's very little chance you're coming back, which was absolutely true. But Hasler countered that with the argument, the moral argument. How on earth can I train these guys up, get them to a point of readiness and then send them off without leading by example? And Sterling would have said the same thing. And they were right. And Courtney too, went on all the original operations. So I'm afraid the guys who create these units do have to carry them out. And by carrying them out, they lead by example, and it makes a difference.
Your point there about it being kind of the Frankton and the Cockleshell Heroes being referenced as a suicide mission is really interesting, I think, because isn't every mission to some extent is a suicide mission in World War II? Look at air crews. Look at if you're a Lancaster crew going into Germany, you know that maybe you're going to get shot down. Your chance of getting shot is you're going to make 5 missions. You've got a 520. So therefore, mathematically, it's a suicide mission, isn't it? So why do we differentiate between a single raid, as was Frankton, which for those who don't know, we'll ask Saul to explain a little bit about that in a second or two. Okay, a single mission like that has a very, very poor chance of returning from, sure. But as I say, Lancaster crews have a very poor chance of returning from 20 missions. A Sherman tank crew engaging enemy armor on a daily basis in Normandy or Italy has a very poor chance of making it through 2 or 3 months. So everybody is facing in a different way those same odds. It's just that with Frankton, for example, it becomes that one single event. So I think the idea about these crazy missions of people going up to beaches in submarines or canoes or full boats, or people climbing up cliffs, whatever it would be, they're inspirational to the rest of the forces as well. If you're in a regular infantry battalion or you're a regular armored unit or engineer unit and you're reading, because we mustn't forget, these sorts of deeds without the details made it into War Illustrated and the wartime newspapers and the newsreels sometimes months later about look at what these great brilliant guys are doing. That's inspirational to everybody else in the force as well. And that's that propaganda idea we talked about at the beginning. We can't measure that though, can we?
No, no, you can't. But no, you're absolutely right about the danger other units were facing. I mean, the submarine service actually, interesting enough, play an absolutely crucial role in the story of the SBS for reasons I've already explained, particularly in the Mediterranean. And their loss rate in the Mediterranean, I think, was the highest. I mean, I haven't seen the absolute figures and compared them to the Bomber Command. It's well known that Bomber Command was about 50%. 50% of all the people who flew in Bomber Command were killed. I mean, unbelievably high casualty rates, but I think they were as high for submariners in the Mediterranean. But anyway, to your broader point, yes, it's absolutely true. I think there are two things to say about comparing a number of missions like pilots go to one mission. Something about the spreading of risk. I know a mathematician would say to me, actually, you're not really spreading it at all, but there's something about that not every single mission is as dangerous as the next one, in your own head, possibly. And the other point about these special operations units is they go behind enemy lines with almost no backup. So there's no, you can't call anyone in to come and get you. The chances of being, they had to be picked up by canoe. You had to get to the right place, get back in your canoe. So just imagine one of those missions that, go back to the Rhodes mission. They come off the beach. They're absolutely freezing. They're in the canoe. They then got to navigate back to the submarine. And there's a very good chance they're going to miss that submarine. And the submarine, by the way, is only on this operation because it's been ordered to. It doesn't really want to carry out this mission. Its job is to sink enemy shipping. That's its first and most crucial task. And it's not going to get a lot of kudos if these special operations missions are successful. It will get kudos if it sinks enemy vessels, both merchant and warships. So, I think there's something about that, going behind enemy lines with no chance of rescue. You're on your own. That takes a certain type of person. Now, we can debate courage, Paul, and of course there are lots of different forms of courage, but this is a particular form. As I think I've described it in the book at one point, this is cold-blooded courage. This is not a guy winning the VC because people all around him are wounded, and if he doesn't do something, everybody's going to die. That's a different type of courage. That's kind of hot-blooded courage, in the heat of the action. To be prepared to approach a shoreline when there was, in particular, the mission we're going to talk about in a minute, Cockleshell Heroes, when there's a very, good chance you're not going to come home. It's going to be arduous. It's going to be tough. It's going to be frightening. Takes a particular type of person. It's not a higher form of courage. It's a different form of courage.
Indeed. So let's talk about Operation Frankton, Cockleshell Heroes, because one of the other things I liked about your book, as I'm dipping in and out of it like a kind of a box of chocolates, as I said earlier, is that you although it's clearly, because it's got it on the cover there, it is SBS, it is that unit. You are very clear to explain that the lineage of other units kind of intersects, they bisect, they merge, they separate. And Operation Frankton is claimed by quite a few people legitimately as their operation, because it was an example of several of these evolving units coming together for something very important. So there will be some people watching this who are unaware of the mission, and there are others who will be very, very well aware of it. But you're putting it in this book here. But let's be clear, it kind of was, as I said a minute ago, a mixture of units involved there. But what was its purpose? Who originated it? And why is it integral to the history of the SBS? Yeah.
Well, I'll answer the last bit first, actually, because a few years ago, before Paddy Ashdown originally, and then I took over the subject. Tragically, Paddy died in midstream, as it were, working on this book. But before that date, if you'd asked someone in the SBS, who's the founding father, they'd have said Hasler, and what was their crucial mission, which is still celebrated as an important day in the SBS calendar, in modern times, it would have been Operation Frankton. So the genesis of the story is very important for the SBS, but there is another reason, I think, well, and I'll come on to it in a second, but there's another reason I think why its importance has overshadowed Courtney and Wilmot, and that is because the SBS, from the end of the Second World War onwards, had a very close association with the Royal Marines. And even today, the bulk of SBS operators come out of the Royal Marines. So, up until, I think, 2001, the SBS was commanded by the Royal Marines. The Commandant of the Royal Marines, that was the chain of command. Now, that they've done away with that now. They answer directly to the boss of the Royal Navy, and then they go through that to the MOD. So the chain of command has been simplified with Special Forces. But anyway, back to the story of Blondie Hasler and the Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment, as it's known, another of these ridiculous acronyms. But let's just call them the Cockleshell Heroes. And the other thing to think of them about is Royal Marine Commandos, because Hasler himself was a regular Royal Marine, so he's come through, but he's a regular Royal Marine who doesn't think like other Royal Marines. He's very much, he latches on to the same idea. The reason I think he absolutely stands as the third of the three great fathers of the SBS is because he also comes up with the same modus operandi, and that is to use canoes. He's originally given the job at the beginning of 1942 to create an exploding motorboat unit, which would mirror what the Italians were doing. And I think you've discussed this in one of your previous shows, haven't you? What the Italians were doing in the Mediterranean. So, the Italians have used this successfully against British shipping. Why don't we have our own unit? Well, Hasler very sensibly realizes, talking about suicide missions, this really is madness, because if you're using an exploding motorboat, there's almost no chance of getting away after that. So much better to go in silently with canoes. And he interestingly comes up with the idea of canoes independently of Courtney and Wilmot, although they all do meet and they all do exchange ideas later on. But he's eventually given the go-ahead to create this unit. He rather cleverly adjusts it, as I said, from exploding motorboats to just using canoes and limpet mines. And the first mission, incredibly, is the most famous, and that's Operation Frankton. So the unit's created in the summer of 1942, and by the autumn of 1942, he gets wind of a possible operation and jumps at it, because of course when you've created your unit, what you want to do is prove that it can work. But it was a wing and a prayer operation. Operation Frankton was to use 6 pairs of canoeists with limpet mines, but to paddle all the way up the Gironde estuary to Bordeaux harbour. Now, we're talking about total distance, including the distance they had to travel when they were dropped off by submarine at the mouth of the harbour, and they couldn't go too close for obvious reasons, because they'd be spotted by the guard ships close to the mouth of the estuary. We're talking about a total distance of 70 miles. Now, this is going to take a number of days, which means, given that they can only travel by night, they're going to have to lie up by day. Now, the other point about this operation is that if and when any of them do get to Bordeaux harbour, and they plant their limpet mines, which are generally timed to go off 5 or 6 hours later, there is going to be no chance of escaping down the estuary, because that's going to take days, and they won't have days. There'll be a hue and cry, and it'll be crawling with Germans searching for them. So the plan really, they didn't really have much of a plan, but the plan was to make their way, to leave the canoes, to destroy the canoes, and make their way inland and try and hook up with the resistance. First of all, in occupied Germany, hopefully getting through to Vichy, which was a little bit safer, but not that much safer, as I will explain. And then finally, make their way all the way back to Spain. I mean, really, very unlikely they were going to achieve it. And to get a sense of how difficult and dangerous this mission was, it starts off on their first day. I think it's on the 6th of December. They're dropped off by submarine at night. And get the month. This is December 1942, incredibly cold seas. So these 6 canoes are dropped off. Only one gets torn as it's coming out of the forward torpedo hatch of the submarine Safari, and those guys can't go on it. And you get this amazing scene, actually. I don't know what you felt when you read it in the book, but it was really quite moving, actually. First of all, the scene on the submarine where the 2 guys who can't go are absolutely heartbroken. They're not thinking, oh my goodness, thank goodness for that. Yeah, what they should have been thinking, well, admittedly, with the benefit of hindsight, but what they should have been thinking is, okay, we can't go, but the good news is we'll probably come out of this alive. What they were actually thinking is, we're heartbroken. We've been training for this and we want to go. I mean, I get that. So they waved goodbye to the 5 canoes. And within an hour, 2 of those 5 canoes moving in darkness, of course, heading up towards the mouth of the estuary, 2 of them have gone over. And they've gone over in freezing water. And this is not good news. As you will know from the story, Paul, one of the teams gets picked up by the other 3 canoes and is then towed inside the estuary mouth, where they hope that they can find landfall and maybe warm up enough. But they've been in the water for more than an hour when they're finally dropped off. They're almost certainly hypothermic by this point, and there's very little chance of them surviving. And of course, they don't survive. And the moving bit, I think one of the most moving bits of the book for me is when they say, say farewell to these guys. everybody understands the situation. They've all agreed beforehand that if anything happens to any of them, they're on their own. So the fact that they've even towed them is really against their original agreement. But by towing them, they've arguably made things more difficult for these guys because, as I say, they've been in the water for a long time. The other pair did manage to make landfall. So they got onto land and then picked up by the Germans. But so now you've got 3 crews left. They've just dumped off this final 2 guys. They literally shake their hands, give them a bit of brandy and move off. And Sparks, who's the paddler for Hasler in canoe number 1, can hear Hasler sobbing as they're paddling away because Hasler knows he's just given these 2 guys a death sentence, and he's absolutely heartbroken by it, but he's still determined to carry out the mission. So they move on, and we're now down to 3 canoes. I mean, within hours, in other words, this Wing and Hope operation is now down to 50% of its teams. And one of those canoes isn't going to get all the way either because it gets damaged. And so that pair then are now on land and on the run. And they make a pretty good fist, actually, of getting to Vichy France, where tragically they're handed over to the Germans by the Vichy France authorities, who don't come very well out of the story. But you've got 2 teams, Hasler and Sparks, and the other pair, who get all the way to Bordeaux Harbour. They hole up just on the edge of the harbour on the night of the 11th, or on the night of the 10th. They hole up they arrive on the night of the 10th. They hole up all the way through the day of the 11th. And then on the night of the 11th, 12th, they paddle up into the main harbour, both sides of the harbour, and they attack different clusters of ships. They put limpet mines on 5 ships, and 4 of those ships are, as they describe, after partially sunk. I mean, the depths aren't deep enough for them to sink completely, but they drop to the bottom, and mission accomplished, but at a horrific cost, because you've now got 2 teams on the run. I mean, they've carried out what is really an astonishing achievement. And the bit where they're actually planting the limpet mines onto the ships, not, by the way, using frogmen, which they depict in the film Cockleshell Heroes, but just using magnetic placement rods, which was the technique when you're in a canoe. I mean, it's even though I knew what was going to happen, as I was reading the sources, and the number of times they're almost spotted and, they're almost captured, it's really on a knife edge. But they manage it. They get away. The Germans don't know they've been there, and the explosions go off, as I've explained, and 4 of those ships are sunk. The charge placed on the 5th ship sadly dropped off and may have gone off on the bottom and partially damaged that ship, but it didn't sink it. But it's still been an incredible achievement. But the butcher's bill was grim. So of the 10 who set off, 6 are captured, 2 drown, 6 are captured by the Germans, handed over to the Gestapo and shot on the Commando order, and only 2, Hasler and Sparks, get all the way back. And that is a story in its own. I mean, I don't deal with it in any great depth in the book, of course, because I don't have space, but it's an amazing story, really. And the relationship between Sparks, who's a Cockney, and Hasler, who comes from pretty well-to-do family, is just wonderful. Some of the conversations they have as they're making their way through France, and the near misses that they almost get picked up. I mean, it's a wonderful story, but to cap it all, really, is the question: was it worth it? And I'm not gonna blacken the names of those incredibly brave men and upset the SBS, frankly, by saying it wasn't worth it. But for the loss of those 10 men, the partial sinking of ships, I don't know. I mean, it's a tough question. I'm not going to answer that question, but it's certainly up for debate.
But this is why when you were going through the harrowing details of that story and drowning on. That I feel guilty for having this. So was it all worth it kind of conversations? Because if we could go back in time, because Sparks lived a long time, didn't he? He was doing the rounds. He did his own books and shows, and I think he even did an opening to the Cockleshell Heroes film, a re-edition version of it, a number of years ago. He would just he'd either be laughing at us or would be punching us in the face for even discussing whether these things were valid, because we're talking about the dark days of 41, 42, 43, when the war isn't going our way fully. And these people were absolutely of the frame of mind that if they could do their bit and that their little bit they could do something like this, like sink a ship, whatever it was, incapacitate a harbour, bring back information, it was absolutely worth it. So in that sense, why should we be debating whether it's worth it when those guys themselves wouldn't have had those conversations at all?
Exactly. I'm going to answer your question because you put it, but I feel slightly uncomfortable going there. Frankly, I mean, it's an astonishing operation with unbelievable bravery, ingenuity, courage. Just the sheer determination to get up that river in appallingly difficult conditions. Frankly, I mean, of course they carried out the mission because it was necessary at that time of the year. Weather conditions were not ideal, to say the least. Really, they deserve to be honoured for that alone. Sparks, as you mentioned, interesting enough, spent a big chunk of his life trying to get VCs or some kind of recognition. Because one of the scandalous things about an operation like this, in my view, is that because no one came back, and the whole point about VC is that people have to witness it, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops. Frankly, I feel very uncomfortable about the reason why a lot of VCs are awarded. And by the way, I'm not just talking about the Second World War here, Paul. I'm going all the way back to the Zulu War, the Crimean War, and even up to the Falklands. There are lots of crazy reasons why. Only the other day, I was talking to someone in the Royal Marines who said to me, "Do you know that the 2 VCs given to the Paras were not recommended by 3 Commando Brigade, which was their chain of command above them. It was recommended above that. So other people stepped in. Now, I'm not saying the VCs weren't deserved there, but I am saying that often there are other kind of slightly uncomfortable factors that play into the decision to award them. And in the case of the Cockleshire Heroes, why no one got a VC for that, I think, is a bit scandalous, frankly. I mean, even if it's just the 2 who get back and we know what they've done, Mountbatten himself says they should have got a better award than the DSO is the next one down. It's pretty impressive. But a lot of people were awarded DSOs in the Second World War for a lot less impressive actions or acts than this.
Yeah, and I think this is, we're going talking about your work as a historian. I think I remember the first TV show I think I saw you do was that Bullets and Bandages one, something like that, about logistics. And with logistics as a historian, it is all about averages. It's all about the supply lines and maintaining that slight advantage, perhaps it may be, over the enemy, so that over the course of weeks, months or years, you are cranking the gears to enable that war effort. That's something you can measure in that kind of tonnage capacity. With something like the SBS or parachute forces, commandos, you kind of have to use the emotional side of your analytical processes, because it is more about inspirational deeds and the feeling that the warm and fuzziness that reading about these events can give you, that pride. You don't necessarily get pride when you read about pipelines bringing gasoline or things like that. You do, but it's more of a, well, that's a good solution, but it doesn't kind of stir the soul. And your book, I've read all the reviews about it today, it does that kind of stirring of the soul, boy's own, daring do, and that we need that. We need that in our examination more sometimes, don't we?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's room for everything. I mean, you would be missing the point if you overdid the argument that these guys made a difference and won the war. You're absolutely right to tease out the argument against that, Paul, because there is a tendency, as we've already discussed, for publishers and even authors to over-egg the pudding. But there is something that stirs the blood, that stirred the blood at the time, as you've quite rightly pointed out, but is still stirring the blood today. I mean, it's not a coincidence that books like, I know, this is me with my commercial hat on. I've written a lot of different books. Some have done very well, some have done less well, and it tends to be the ones with the extraordinary deeds that sell the most. So that's telling me that's what people want to read. Now, that's not what I want to write entirely or solely, but you can't ignore that, particularly if you want to make a living out of writing, or you want to make a living out of telling history in any format. You can't ignore it. And there is something, I think, really quite special about a nation like ours that was really on the back foot in the Second World War. I'm not going to overdo the sort of current resonances to all of that, but people often, and I'm sure you've had a lot of criticism over the years. I certainly have as a historian writing about military history. Goodness knows why, because I've always had a slightly sardonic take to my military history. But anyway, there's been a lot of criticism about the fact that we still hark back as Britons to the Second World War, but there's a very good reason for that. And the reason is things couldn't have looked grimmer, and yet there was a doughty determination to carry on in any way we could. And I think the special forces, the special operations units of the Second World War, absolutely sum up that attitude, that determination, grim determination to carry on like the guys on the submarine safari who are heartbroken at not going on a suicide mission. I mean, it just says everything, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking of the old Beyond the Fringe sketch with Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller about what we need now, chaps, is a futile gesture. That kind of just do something for the sake of doing it, to strike back because you can, because we want to show we can do this stuff. And that's the thing that people can get from a book like yourself, or the work of someone like Damien Lewis about the SAS and those other authors that are telling these stories you couldn't make up, these ones of just disparate figures coming together, that if you put them in an outline for a screenplay for a movie as a fictional character, they go, well, these lot are complete crazies. But in reality, these people did come together. And as we've always thought about with that kind of founding fathers of the Commanders, it was about who you knew. Someone would come in and they would know someone else from their university days or their unit days. Now I can bring this guy in, he's a nutter like me. And we kind of ended up with this branch of, as you said earlier, private armies. And we need that. We need to be inspired by that. So my kind of final question would be, is I know it's had massive, great success and it's bestsellers and that, but what, compared to other books, I guess you are hoping for a broader audience of, young people, perhaps it's the cliche, bringing in those kind of teenage readers to be excited by military history rather than being impressed by someone's grasp again, as we said, logistics. So it's that kind of little boy reading it under the blanket at night with a torch. Is it something like that you're looking for with that book as well?
It's really interesting because you talk about the boy's own element of this, and it's there, of course, it's there. I try in all my books to give a decent context. I try to explain why they're asked to do these things, and I try to give a bit of strategy as I'm going along the way. But actually, the real attraction of these books are the missions. So there is a boy's own element, but it's been interesting. The response has not just been from the male audience. There's been really a very positive response from female audience too, and I'm not used to that, to be honest. And so it's really interesting. The stirring of the blood of these stories can affect everyone and of all ages. You don't have to have a direct connection to the Second World War, and I think it's stories like these which will keep the good stories like these, as well as bad stories, will keep interest in the Second World War going long after the current generation have died out. And of course, they are dying out. They've almost died out completely in terms of the actual practitioners, still being alive today.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I make a conscious effort with my programming to kind of give people something sort of heart-stirring and kind of daring do, and then something a bit more about the importance of how operations are planned in the Mediterranean theatre. I did with Richard Hammond a couple of weeks ago. That kind of here's something more kind of ethereal. Here's something kind of to inspire you, and here's something about just data, the data-driven aspect of how we won the war by this. When we talked about ultra and code breakings, and it's about bringing people in and then getting to go across the genres. So they come in because they read a Commando book, but then they go on to read about naval intelligence or something like that. So what are you working on right now? What's the next project?
Well, there's a book finished, which is Devil Dogs, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, is the story of a unit of Marines fighting all the way through the Pacific. And that's quite exciting because that's going to be coming out in the US next year, as well as the UK. So that's great. Always nice to have a transatlantic launch, so to speak. But of course, I'm always one book ahead of the one that's about to come out. And I'm currently working on Airborne in the Second World War. So all those other stories that, in some ways it mirrors SBS, but it's on a much bigger scale, and you could argue that there is a strategic sort of sense to the or logic, as it were, to the purpose of the Airborne. We'll be having this conversation if I come on and talk to you about them in 2 or 3 years' time, Paul, as to the value of Airborne. But I think a lot. I'll make a lot of the very similar arguments. I mean, I'm looking at operations as small as Operation Colossus, which was the first one in 1941 to destroy the bridge in Italy, all the way through, of course, to Arnhem and then Varsity. Little known but very successful airborne operation crossing the Rhine, and also, of course, the famous things like Pegasus Bridge, which plays, as you well know, a really key role in the success of D-Day. So there's some great stories there, but it's tying the whole thing together, the human story, and I'll tell it, albeit on a bigger scale, in much the same way I've told SBS.
No, absolutely. And I have to say, when I received the book, I didn't know it was going to be that thick. I probably hadn't read the page count. I thought it's an SBS, but there can't be that much to the story. And I'm sensing there was a lot more stuff you could have put in as well, especially with that early stages where the units are morphing and small scale raiding force, all those other ones, that the divergent stories that happen there. So I haven't read it all yet, but when I have read, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So I think we'll leave it there, folks. It'll leave you people wanting more, because that's the way. Bring you back another time. So have you enjoyed talking about it with us tonight, Sol?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It was great having this chat. Actually, I've given a set piece talk many times, and obviously I make the selection. But you're very canny about teasing out the fault lines in history. I think that's your real strength. And it's, practitioners like us often forget that. You get drawn into the story that you're working on, and you sometimes forget the little nuances that along the way. So I appreciate it. I really do. I really enjoyed tonight.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just remind people what we got coming up, and I'll say goodbye in a second. So, folks, another odd show tomorrow. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow night, just like I was today. David A. Harrisville is coming on to talk about his book that's out this month about the Wehrmacht, the clean Wehrmacht myth in World War II. The fact that we think of the SS, they were the bad guys, the Wehrmacht, they were the good guys. Well, David Harrisville is going to absolutely blow that apart and talk about what they were doing in the Eastern Front. So be prepared to be really amazed by that show, because I've looked at the PowerPoint today and it's just outstanding stuff. We're going to be bringing your way tomorrow. So that's going to be tomorrow. As usual, don't forget to follow us on social media. The links to purchase Saul's book are in the description below. Some people said it's not available in America. It is available in America. It's available everywhere right now. It's brilliant. Audio book as well. I thoroughly urge you to go out and get it, because it's just thoroughly brilliant. So thanks for watching, everybody. And right now, just say thank you very much, Saul, for joining us. And we will look forward to having you back on another occasion when the next book comes out. So
cheers, Paul.
Cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodard for World War II TV saying I will see you all tomorrow night to talk about the Wehrmacht and what they really got up to in World War II. It will be brilliant. Thanks very much, everybody. See you next time. Bye.